as the Terror Famine, was a devastating man-made famine that occurred in Soviet Ukraine between 1932 and 1933 under the rule of Joseph Stalin. This dark chapter in history claimed the lives of an estimated 3.5 to 7 million Ukrainians, though exact numbers remain disputed. The famine was not merely the result of poor harvests or natural disaster. It was a deliberate and calculated policy by the Soviet regime to crush Ukrainian nationalism, enforce collectivization, and assert total control over Ukraine's agricultural production. In the early 1930s, Stalin's Soviet Union was pushing hard to collectivize agriculture. Private farms were being replaced by large state-controlled collectives, and the grain harvested was requisitioned to fuel the state's industrial ambitions. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe for its vast wheat fields, was a prime target for these policies. The Soviet government demanded increasingly unrealistic grain quotas from Ukrainian farmers, forcibly taking not only their crops, but also their seeds for future planting, livestock, and any remaining food stores. Local authorities and Soviet enforcers confiscated grain ruthlessly, leaving families with nothing to eat. What makes the Holodomor especially chilling is the Soviet government's absolute indifference and, in many cases, outright hostility toward the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Even as it became clear that millions were starving, Stalin refused to ease the quotas or provide relief. Soviet propaganda downplayed the famine, labeling reports of starvation as anti-Soviet lies. Borders were closed, preventing both the starving population from fleeing and external aid from entering. The famine became a tool of political repression, used to crush resistance to collectivization and eliminate any threat of Ukrainian nationalism. Those caught hoarding even the smallest amounts of grain were branded enemies of the state, often executed or deported to Siberian gulags. The suffering of the Ukrainian people during the Holodomor was unimaginable. Starvation drove people to extreme measures, including cannibalism, as entire villages were wiped out by hunger. Families who had once been prosperous farmers found themselves reduced to begging in the streets or foraging for anything remotely edible, like grass or tree bark. Parents watched helplessly as their children wasted away from malnutrition. The death toll was exacerbated by widespread disease, which swept through the malnourished population, and by Soviet policies that blocked access to food and medical aid. The emotional impact of this tragedy cannot be overstated. Fear permeated every level of society, as anyone could be denounced as a kulak, a wealthy peasant or enemy of the state, and face execution or deportation. Greed and envy ran rampant as Soviet officials and loyalists hoarded food and resources for themselves while their neighbors starved. Anger festered against the Soviet regime, but speaking out was met with brutal retribution. The environment was one of terror, where even sharing a loaf of bread could be seen as an act of rebellion. Meanwhile, the wider world remained largely ignorant of the scale of the famine due to the Soviet Union's tight control of information. The Holodomor is often considered a genocide by scholars and governments today, as it was deliberately engineered to weaken Ukraine as both a nation and a cultural identity. It wiped out a significant portion of the rural population and crushed any resistance to Soviet rule. Stalin's regime used starvation as a weapon, effectively erasing Ukraine's intellectual and political leadership, along with its rural class, which had been the backbone of Ukrainian culture. In doing so, the Soviet Union cemented its control over Ukraine, but at the cost of millions of innocent lives. What makes this story even more haunting is its relative obscurity in mainstream historical discussions, despite its enormous human toll. While events like the Holocaust have rightly garnered much attention, the Holodomor often remains in the shadows. The Soviet Union's efforts to suppress information about the famine were highly effective, and for decades the world knew little about the true extent of the suffering. Even today, there is controversy over how to categorize the Holodomor, with some still debating whether it should be labeled a genocide or a consequence of mismanagement and poor policy. This dark moment in history is a chilling reminder of how political power can be wielded to destroy entire populations, not just through violence, but through the deliberate withholding of life's most basic necessity, food. The Holodomor shows the extremes of human suffering and cruelty where government policies were driven by cold calculation, ideological fervor, and greed, and the lives of millions were extinguished with horrifying indifference. For those seeking to understand the depths of human despair and the unchecked power of authoritarian regimes, the story of the Holodomor is as emotionally potent as it is historically important.